There should be a time frame and a deadline for Hamas disarmament, because frankly this is being allowed to drag out, and Hamas have repeatedly stated publicly that they have no intention of disarming. And then we come on to the question of, in particular, Turkey and Qatar pushing for forces on the ground, especially from Turkey. Now that is very worrying when you consider Turkey's attitude and approach to Israel, not just throughout this war, but over the last decade, certainly. It rather suggests that we would be seeing the introduction of forces on the ground in Gaza that would be fighting Israel alongside Hamas.
Okay, everyone, I am thrilled to be joined once again by an absolute superstar, Natasha Hausdorff, barrister, expert in international law, and unparalleled defender of Israel. Natasha, thanks so much for joining us. How are you doing?
Ollie, thank you for such an incredible introduction. I'm doing extremely well. It's great to be with you.
Well, it's great to have you on the show again. I know our audience just love learning from you. Unfortunately, some of the topics we have to discuss are a little dark, but at the same time, we need an injection of sanity and clarity and facts so that we are armed when, we were just chatting a few days ago on WhatsApp when I sent you a story that I want to cover about the Gaza death figures and how it's fake news, the ratio of combatant to non-combatant, what we're being told. There's so much misinformation out there and huge figures in the media and in politics that amplify these lies. And so it just becomes such a challenge to figure out what is true and what is false. And so that's why we need your voice more than ever. And I want to start off by talking about this horrendous tragedy that occurred in Bondi Beach in Australia. And we've also just learned now about a Manchester terror shooting spree that had been foiled, that was planned for last year. On top of that, we actually had that stabbing attack at a Manchester synagogue, and that's why I found it pretty absurd that the Australian Prime Minister Albanese said, we're going to have stricter gun laws. How would that have stopped the Manchester stabbing attack? So you've spoken about, I've seen from some of your media appearances, how we cannot, when trying to address what we're seeing on our streets and these anti-Semitic terror incidents, you cannot ignore what's happened over the last 2 years on Western capitals. And, as the Jewish Chronicle had as their headline, the Intifada has been globalized, they said in the aftermath of Bondi. Can you explain to our viewers, so they understand clearly and can explain clearly, how the hate marches that we've seen on the streets has amplified and energized and given energy really to these kinds of vitriolic violence and ideologies?
So I think in two key respects. The first is that when they began on the 8th of October, or some indeed in London on the 7th of October 2023, they were still a relatively small number of people. The Globalize the Intifada chant was introduced very, very soon after the 7th of October. Of course, it had been used before then as well, but in these regular hate marches. And the celebration of the 7th of October attacks themselves were self-evident from what we saw on the streets of London in the immediate aftermath. But the nature of the people involved was still relatively constrained. That changed as these marches became normalized. And I think that is as a direct result of the failure of the police and, let's face it, the Home Office, the authorities more broadly in the United Kingdom, to police properly and to apply the law in respect of these hate marches, the support for terrorism, the support for Hamas, and these calls for genocide from the river to the sea against Jewish Israelis in the land of Israel. As a result of that failure to clamp down, to properly apply the law, the Terrorism Act, the Public Order Act, we've seen these two parallel phenomena. One is that more sort of ordinary people who perhaps weren't particularly interested in the subject matter before the 7th of October, who perhaps aren't particularly educated in the issues since the 7th of October, and some of them, I'm sure, from the perspective of a fashionable thing to do, have joined the ranks of those initial individuals who began these hate marches. It became the acceptable practice on a Saturday afternoon, and indeed, in many respects, it was a case of virtue signaling. I care about genocide. I care about individuals who are being oppressed and slaughtered if they bought into that false rhetoric. And so the numbers grew exponentially. And I'd say the second aspect of that is the impact that the mainstreaming of these calls for genocide had, which is necessarily to encourage those real extremists in their views and to encourage them, unfortunately, to execute on that rhetoric, that promise of globalizing the Intifada, of slaughtering Jews, and of making sure that that is not just in Israel from the river to the sea, but that it is also around the world, in the UK, in Manchester, in Australia, on Bondi Beach, are two examples of that. But the fact that we've had recent terror plots foiled in many, many places, often we understand with the assistance of Israeli intelligence. All of this really indicates that the problem that has erupted from those two parallel tracks of the widening of support for those sorts of genocidal cries, and also the encouragement of the extremists in their agenda as a result of it. I mean, all of that, I think, squarely comes back to the failure of the authorities to nip this in the bud, as so many of us were saying immediately after the 7th of October 2023. I was on a panel organised by the Free Speech Union with Lord Ken MacDonald, former DPP, Jonathan Hall, also KC, the Independent Reviewer of Terror Legislation, and there was a general consensus that we were witnessing, in the previous week even, activity at these marches that the police ought to have been dealing with, ought to have at least been investigating. My position was perhaps a little firmer than the other two gentlemen, but there was a general consensus that not enough was being done. And that was, I recall, something like November 2023. So really early on in this process. They can't say they weren't warned. They cannot say, after representations were made to the Home Office, to the police, constant communications, also from the organisations that organise counter-protests. Stop the Hate has done extraordinary work, standing up in opposition to these hate marches on a weekly basis and liaising with the police closely, but seeking to make the case that they are not doing their job properly. And it is harrowing, deeply harrowing, that it has taken loss of life on this scale to finally wake these people up.
And I want to know about your reaction to the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan. I saw a clip of him recently where he was asked about the phrase "from the river to the sea," particularly in the aftermath of Bondi Beach, because we had all these chants and many people were saying, inside and outside the Jewish community, that is a call for genocide. When he was confronted by that by Susan Hall, a London Assembly member, she said, "Is this an anti-Semitic chant?" He said, "No, I think it depends on the context." We had Zoran Mamdani also. We've heard that before, right? We've had Zoran Mamdani say that globalize the Intifada. You know, he refused to condemn that. Do you would you accept that there could be a context in which someone saying "from the river to the sea, Palestine must be free, shall be free" is not anti-Semitic?
That formulation of words, no. And for this reason, that the very essence of the phrase in relation to freeing Palestine necessarily means freeing it of Jews. It
They would
is
deny that.
baked in. They do that perhaps publicly, but privately there is a different narrative. I think the big question is, where does this phrase originate from? It doesn't mean that every individual repeating it is necessarily an anti-Semitic, is necessarily an anti-Semite. Your question was, is the phrase itself
Yeah.
anti-Semitic? And I think, misguided people can repeat anti-Semitic phraseology without realizing what it is that they are doing. And we've seen this in respect of those masses that I indicated that thought it was okay to join these protests and indeed thought that they were good people by virtue of doing so. But this phrase necessarily comes out of this, Palestine Liberation Organization, which was established. And it's important to acknowledge, when this was founded, the PLO, this terror organization, it was founded in 1964. So before Israel recovered territories in Judea and Samaria, sometimes called the West Bank, and Gaza from Egypt and Jordan, before it did so, Israel was reduced in a reduced size because some of its territory was being occupied. And so the phrase and the impetus behind it ultimately originates from that context. There's no suggestion that there was simply a case of freeing disputed territories. And the ultimate question here is, what do they mean by Palestine? And linking Palestine to that geographical area from the river to the sea, which incorporates all of Israel, that is ultimately the acid test here. That is what is so telling about the meaning of this phrase and the fact that it is, in my opinion, deeply anti-Semitic. That is then buttressed when you look at the realities on the ground. So the Palestinian-controlled areas within that space from the river to the sea, in Gaza until this war, and certainly in the West Bank in areas A and B where the Palestinian Authority governed that territory, those areas are Jew-free. So even if it's not a case of slaughtering all of the Jews from the river to the sea, which is more in the vein of globalize the Intifada, that involves murder, mass murder. What we have seen is a requirement that so-called Palestinian areas be made Jew-free. And that is why saying that Palestine will be free from the river to the sea is inevitably anti-Semitic, because it is calling for, whether these people realize it or not, because of the origins of the phrase, because of the realities on the ground, it is calling for the eradication of Jews from that territory. And that's, by definition, anti-Semitic.
Sure. Yeah, no, I completely agree. And what's particularly harrowing is that Rabbi Eli Schlanger, who was murdered, who set up the Hanukkah event, he had written a letter to Albanese recently and warned him and urged him to reverse his decision to recognize a Palestinian state. And he said that this will lead to a surge in anti-Semitism. Can you explain to our viewers, so they're clear about this, why that is necessarily the case, why there is a causal link between the two?
Well, for a very similar reason to the endorsement of these hate marches, because it is, in this respect, giving in to terror. That recognition, meaningless, I should stress, in the context of international law, because the so-called state of Palestine does not comply with the recognized criteria under international law that are required for statehood under the Montevideo Convention. But albeit it's meaningless in the legal and in the international relations sense, it does inevitably fuel this fire of genocidal hatred. And it gives legitimacy and encouragement to those that are pursuing this genocidal agenda. I think it's just important that I clarify, because I've seen various reports, especially on the from the river to the sea phrase. There was a suggestion, and I believe it's accurate, that this was also used at some point in the many election cycles by the Likud party, that from the river to the sea, this is in relation to the existence of Israel. And there are many that call for Israel to hold on to the territory that it had in 1948 from the river to the sea, including East Jerusalem and the entirety of the West Bank. But there is a critical difference between the use of that phrase in that context. There we go, context. But here it's relevant. And that is that from the river to the sea, between the river and the sea, within the state of Israel, you have Israeli citizens of every imaginable religion. And I say that because I know many who have traveled even from the East have applied for and obtained Israeli citizenship. And so you've got the full spectrum of religions, backgrounds, races, if you will, and they are treated equally as Israeli citizens. And that is the significant difference between talking about the existence of Israel from the river to the sea, where those who identify as Palestinian Arabs, or actually more commonly within Israel as Israeli Arabs, are the only free Arabs in the Middle East and have full citizen rights. And the flip side, the original phrase that you put to me in relation to this, so-called concept of Palestine. So with reference to the recognition of this concept of Palestine, the big question is, or the recognition of a state of Palestine, and one of the reasons that it cannot fulfill the criteria of statehood, what are its borders? What is its territory? And here we come on to a significant issue, which is incorporating historical revisionism and completely ignoring the facts, which is that the so-called state of Palestine is today presented as something that existed prior to Israel's establishment. This narrative that Israel was established in place of Palestine and the Palestinians, or that the land was stolen, and that kind of reductive, the simplistic, people came to this country illegitimately and kicked others out, or all of which has frankly been disproven by many academics going through relevant sources, and there have been some great books written on this, including The Myth of Deir Yassin by Eliezer Tauber, which is a fantastic historical analysis on one of the major myths of what happened in 1948. But when one considers the conflation of that term, of what was previously the Mandate Palestine, in which there were Jews, Arabs, Muslims, and others living as Palestinians. The concept of exclusively Arab Palestinian national identity was, again, something that came along with the PLO, with Yasser Arafat in the 1960s.
If I'm not mistaken, it was actually the Arabs living there who identified more as Arabs and Jews living there as Palestinians.
And that's a very fair comment. And the reason for that is because that the institutions of Palestine under the Mandate were built by the Jewish community. And the football team, the Palestine football team, comprised Jewish players. Visit Palestine, the Tourist Information Center, was an initiative of the Jewish Agency here to encourage tourism and commerce and trade. And all of the state institutions, which were the reason that Israel was ultimately able to constitute itself as a state to declare independence in 1948, they were set up by the Jewish community. They had a cohesive national identity, which ultimately gave birth to the Israeli. There wasn't an equivalent amongst the local Arab population at the time. They identified according to their tribes and where it is that they had come from in the Middle East. And one can see that in terms of the names. In fact, there have been some recent publications of lists of names of those in Gaza and their origins. For example, the most common name in Gaza is Al-Masri, which means the Egyptian. So that's an important aspect of the historical context of why it is that there was no cohesive concept of exclusively Arab Palestinian national identity when Israel was formed. If these individuals today, I would argue, for what seem to be political purposes that are geared towards the destruction of the state of Israel, but nonetheless, if they today seek to identify as a nation of Palestinian Arabs, that is a matter entirely for them. But they cannot rewrite history. And the rewriting of history here is integral to the story that is being spun about Israel's illegitimacy, seeking to demonize it. And that is the thread that has run through all of these hate marches, all of this incitement. And, it all comes back to this uptick in violence that we're seeing against Jews around the world. Some people have had the audacity to suggest that Jews are being targeted around the world because of Israel's actions. And it is the complete inverse. It is Israel that is being targeted as the Jewish state because of the age-old antisemitism. And that is then also used as an excuse to target Jews around the world. But we have known since Israel's establishment that it is a strong Israel that strengthens the Jewish diaspora. And I think it was comforting and inspiring to see the Diaspora Affairs Minister, Amichai Chikli, get straight on the plane to Australia and be there to comfort those who are mourning the losses at Bondi Beach.
Yeah, indeed. And this total inversion of morality. Just hold on for a second. We'll be back to the video in a moment, but I want to share something really important with you. JTV every single day is churning out free videos busting the myths about Israel, shine the light of Jewish ideas and wisdom to a world that needs it more than ever. But we need your help. We don't have a big foundation or big donor that backs us. We're powered by you. Please click the link below in the video description and partner with us in helping JTV reach millions more people than ever before by contributing to our annual campaign. I'm so grateful for any support you can give. And please watch our short campaign video, which shows you everything we're doing and what we're all about. Thank you so much for your support.
On JTV, the global Jewish channel with a host named Ollie.
Well, when even she's talking about you, you know you're having an impact. Thanks for the promo, Candice.
When I launched JTV, the mission was simple: to bring Jewish ideas to the world, intelligently, creatively, proudly. But I never realised just how critical that mission would become today. Because let's be honest, look at the world right now. Anti-Semitic voices aren't just coming from one place anymore. They're rising from the left and the right, online and offline, from influencers to institutions. That makes voices like ours more crucial than ever. When the noise gets louder, the Jewish voice needs to get stronger. And that's exactly why JTV exists. And look how far we've come. Because of your support, JTV has grown in extraordinary ways. Our videos now reach millions across continents with clear, honest, original content at a time when the world needs clarity more than ever. Whether it's telling the uncompromising truth about Israel or the incredible depth and wisdom of Jewish ideas. We've brought you exclusive interviews with leading thinkers, creators, and voices shaping the Jewish and Israel conversation today. And in addition to our new members streaming platform, we've produced powerful documentaries that are freely available on our YouTube channel for everyone to watch, exploring the challenges and triumphs of the Jewish story. And the best part? We're not just talking to an echo chamber. Our audience is made up of Jews and non-Jews in equal measure, of all ages and backgrounds. You've watched us grow, video by video, story by story, but this is just the beginning. Now JTV is ready for its next leap forward, to scale our content, expand our reach, and bring thoughtful and inspiring Jewish media to an even wider global audience. And this is where you come in. Your support fuels everything: the research, the cameras, the creativity, the deeper investigations, the editing, the more high-profile interviews, and the bold ideas that inspire pride, wisdom, and truth. Every viewer matters, every story counts, and every donation helps JTV grow, not just in numbers, but in global impact. So if you've ever appreciated one of our videos, if JTV has ever informed you, inspired you, or helped you help others, please help us grow by clicking the link in the video description and donating to our campaign fundraiser. With your help, you won't just watch us grow, you'll help us grow even higher. Thank you, and keep watching us grow. Inversion of cause and effect, inversion of perpetrator. In the last 2 years in particular, I've been so, it's not disturbed because I'm not surprised to see it, but sickened by this. I don't believe in targeting children and Israel killing children, whether it's from Tucker Carlson, now we're starting to see it on the right in America, to Piers Morgan, to we've heard it from the left for a long time. And the inversion, we all know that it is Hamas who are seeking genocide. It is Hamas that's targeting men, women, and children. And the greatest irony of all, and personal offence that I took when Israel, not only as you have pointed out, has shown unprecedented levels of surgical precision in Gaza, but more importantly, and the reason why I take offence, at the expense of Israeli lives, Israeli soldiers' lives, going into Gaza on foot. Now, I know part of that is because they wanted to go house by house to protect the hostages, and the morality of that has been something that we've been debated on this channel for a while because it's very complicated. There's very different factors to take into account. But regardless, the fact is they have, in terms of Western standards of fighting wars, they've shown this incredible level of surgical precision, and yet the accusations get more extreme. I wanted to get your thoughts on that story that I referenced earlier, just to give us people a bit of clarity on this. A Guardian story, I don't know if it was the Guardian that provided the exclusive here, but it says, revealed Israeli military's own data indicates civilian death rate of 83% in Gaza war. Figures from classified IDF database listed 8,900 named fighters as dead or probably dead in May, as overall death toll reached 53,000. You told me that this is fake news. Could you give us a bit more information about this?
It's entirely false. And in fact, it's demonstrably false from the text of the article itself, where The Guardian writes a couple of paragraphs down, at that time, 53,000 Palestinians had been killed by Israeli attacks. Again, it's important to stress at this point that that is a number that comes from the Hamas authorities. It cannot be trusted. It has been debunked serially through analysis by various academics and statisticians that have demonstrated the internal inconsistency of those numbers. But that is the number that the Guardian is using as a starting point, so be it. And it says, according to health authorities in Gaza, a toll that included combatants and civilians, fighters named in the Israeli military intelligence database accounted for just 17% of the total, which indicates that 83% of the dead were civilians. Now, Ollie, that is a total non sequitur. They have taken the analysis, which I don't believe it's been published in Israel, but nonetheless, there has been commentary that Israeli intelligence has identified by name the individuals that account for 17% of the total that Hamas claims. So put that into perspective. That on no account is any authority for the suggestion, and indeed the conclusion that the Guardian jumped to, that the others are civilians. And we've seen examples of this time and time again, of the media and others twisting statistics and analysis in exactly this fashion. I mean, I remember, a while ago I did a monk debate in Toronto with Douglas Murray, and Mehdi Hassan was on the other side. And one of the outrageously false allegations that he put forward was in response to my talking about workers that had come in from Gaza to the kibbutzim and moshavim in the south of Israel on permits. And some of them were agricultural, some of them worked in the communities themselves. But we know that some of these individuals collected data and intelligence on the communities that they later attacked. We know that because of the detailed nature of the instructions that many of the terrorists crossed the border with. Maps of these communities, indicators of who the head of the security of a kibbutz was, where the arms were kept, the armory, who to take out first. Those were the instructions on the basis of data compiled by workers who had been permitted into Israel with these permits, who gathered intelligence for Hamas. And Mehdi Hassan's suggestion was that the Shin Bet, the Shabak in Israel, had investigated this and found that it was not the case, that no worker had been identified as in any way involved in the 7th of October attacks. But that is not what had been published in the Israeli press. What the internal Israeli security services had said is that out of those individuals that they had at that stage investigated, they had not found a connection with individuals who were here on permits. I imagine that position has now changed, so nearly 2 years later. But it's this same phenomenon of taking a piece of information and totally inverting it and misrepresenting it, as The Guardian have also done in this article, to suggest something that is in keeping with their narrative against Israel and their attempt to consistently delegitimize Israel. And here, of course, we do have Israeli estimates on the real civilian to combatant casualty ratio from the early parts of the war that were released by the Israeli authorities, which they have completely ignored. And the reason they have ignored them is that they are not consistent with the narrative that The Guardian and others wish to put out. Why? Because in the initial stages of the war, when this information was more readily accessible and therefore published, The ratios that Israel was estimating were in the region of 1 to 1 or 1.5 to 1 on these civilian casualties, civilians to combatants. 1 to 1 or 1.5 to 1 is unprecedented in urban armed conflict. And that's before we get into the unimaginable challenges that Hamas presented to the Israeli forces in Gaza because of their policy of using civilians as human shields or even human sacrifices, and because of their policy of embedding themselves in these civilian areas, quite before we get to the inflated casualty figures that they have been putting out. So that's, perhaps some sort of explanation, but it beggars belief that The Guardian and others can get away with publishing this blatantly false information. And then, of course, it is repeated by many who simply take this at face value, who read the headline and don't actually analyse the text itself. We've seen other examples of this, for example, with respect to the starving baby pictures, which have all been debunked on the basis that investigations have demonstrated that each of these children who were in dire states were in that situation because of very serious underlying health conditions, not because Israel was starving the Palestinians in Gaza. We know that that is not the case because we have access to information about the volume of aid that was going into Gaza throughout the entirety of this period. But if you read, I remember one article published in Sky News, a few paragraphs down, it was actually entirely clear from the way that the article had been written, at least it was clear to me, that the journalist knew full well that this was a child that was very unwell, probably because the journalist was sitting next to the very well-fed mother who was with the child and in fact photographed with the child as part of this article, but knew full well that this child had underlying health difficulties, a serious medical condition, and yet was twisting the story in order to suggest that Israel was responsible. And certainly the headline left no reader in any doubt that the Sky article in that case, although there were others in The Guardian, that these authors were blaming Israel for the state of these children. It's a phenomenon, it's a pattern that we see across reporting in Israel. But you are right, it is fake news.
And obviously, we talk a lot about the combatant to non-combatant ratio because of these ridiculous charges and accusations. And by the way, I'm bewildered, but not really bewildered, that you have, again, people like Sadiq Khan that will go on TV or on social media and do a message like, what's happening in Gaza is terrible, 50,000 dead. Do you not want to specify how many of those are Hamas? And if you don't, why are you mourning, let's say, if roughly half of those are Hamas fighters? There's something I find like potentially really insightful in that message.
I agree. Celebrating the elimination of terrorists is something that certainly I would encourage the Mayor of London to engage in, but also acknowledging the extraordinary efforts that Israel has undertaken in order to minimize civilian casualties despite Hamas's best efforts to increase them. I was in Gaza with senior military officials, including from the United Kingdom, who said, we've never seen rules of engagement like this. We've never seen operating principles that put the preservation of civilian life in Gaza at such a high, and that are meticulous in their approach to precaution, to ensuring that civilians are successfully evacuated and are protected wherever possible. And that included civilian humanitarian corridors that was defending against Hamas fire, while Hamas was seeking to kill civilians that were leaving these areas. It was so desperate to hold on to its human shields. That is the reality. That is the assessment of the experts. And then you have so many, frankly, crocodile tears on the basis of this false information. And the reason I use that term is because I do not take any one of these individuals seriously who profess to care about power, because I have not heard one of them call for Egypt to comply with its obligations under international law, under the African Union Convention on Refugees, which it's where it is required to provide safe passage ultimately to civilians fleeing civil disorder. Egypt sealed its border and prevented civilians who couldn't pay extortionate amounts of money from leaving the Gaza Strip. It is unprecedented in the history of armed conflict that civilians have been forcibly kept in a war zone in this fashion, and equally unprecedented that that has been done with the blessing of the international community. And all of those who have either professed to care about civilian deaths in Gaza in the London Assembly, as Sadiq Khan has done, or on these marches on a regular basis, who have not made that simple call for Egypt to comply with obligations, for these civilians to be moved to a place of safety where they can no longer be abused by Hamas, used as human shields, and where Hamas has continued, even with respect to al-Mawasi, the humanitarian zone that Israel established. It was firing missiles onto Israeli civilians from within these supposed safe zones and exploiting them, abusing them, using them in this fashion. Until I hear these individuals who profess to care about Palestinian civilians in Gaza remark on any of this, I cannot take them seriously. And the fact of the matter is, since October 2023, I have been making that case.
So I'm curious to know about what Israel or any army's obligation is in international law when it comes to what kind of ratio of combatant to non-combatant should be expected. Like, what is Israel or any army that seeks to obey international law expected to do? Because, you know, one of the questions I've had at the back of my mind is a lot of Israeli soldiers' lives are being lost, 4 times the amount than there were hostages in Gaza, on the altar of being as surgically precise as possible. And I sometimes wonder about the morality of that.
Well, there isn't an answer to your question, Ollie, in terms of an acceptable ratio. Firstly, that would be macabre. But second, it's not how international law, the law of armed conflict here works. It is not an effects-based analysis. The law of armed conflict or international humanitarian law is predicated on the intention and the assessment of the reasonable military commander before action is taken. So, for example, the concept of proportionality, which, of course, you know, the world and his wife seem to be claiming Israel is acting disproportionately. First of all, they have no basis upon which to make that assessment because they don't know the information, the intelligence upon which individual strikes were based. It's worth adding that the 2 states that Israel has shared some of that sensitive intelligence with are the US and the UK, and the position of both has consistently been that they do not have concerns about Israel's compliance with IHL regarding proportionality and targeting. And that, I think, is extremely telling. Again, not something you will see The Guardian reporting, but that is certainly been the consistent public position, and it's also very clearly implied, even by the UK's decision to implement an arms embargo on Israel by suspending 30 armed licenses. They did so on the basis of claims that they had concerns on detention and aid, both of which I would very strongly argue were not founded on the realities of and the publicly available information, in fact, that ought to have been taken into consideration. But it's important to note that proportionality and targeting was not raised as a concern in order to seek to justify the UK's arms embargo. So the countries that have seen this intelligence say they don't have an issue with Israel's approach here. And frankly, that is because the approach that the IDF has taken to target selection, target approval, the involvement of military lawyers, and the application of these core principles of international humanitarian law, military necessity, distinction, proportionality, and precaution, what the IDF have exhibited over the last few years is utterly unprecedented, going way above the requirements of international humanitarian law, and in fact setting standards that are unprecedented, and that many other militaries say they would have extreme difficulty in following. Principally for that reason, because necessarily by Israel upholding these standards, they're in excess of what international law requires, not taking strikes, even though it is allowing Hamas terror operatives to continue to live and to fight, not taking those strikes if they consider that there are too many civilians in the vicinity, going house to house to target specifically Hamas terrorists and minimize civilian collateral damage, targeting strikes with precision weaponry. When one hears of people talking about the ratio of bombs dropped to casualties, that the conclusions one has to draw are either that Israel is utterly incompetent in killing anyone with the volume of bombs that it has dropped, or these are so precise that the ratio of casualties to strikes is in fact very, very low, and that those precise strikes are targeting Hamas terror infrastructure and Hamas combatants. But as I say, the flip side of this is accurate. What any moral arming does when it puts the civilians on the other side at that as such a high priority in terms of protecting them is necessarily incur additional casualties than it might otherwise have if it adopted a blunter approach to targeting the enemy. And that is a price that the IDF have paid. But it is reflective of, I would argue, the moral approach that they have taken to this conflict.
If they'd have chosen a blunter approach, would that still be legitimate in international law?
That very much depends on weighing up the anticipated military advantage of a strike against the expected civilian or collateral damage. But I would fully anticipate that in many instances it would, depending on the circumstances. The fact of the matter is that Israel has used airstrikes throughout the armed conflict, but that has also been in conjunction with a very significant ground operation. That has also been in conjunction the different units that were involved in that ground operation with destroying the tunnels, destroying booby-trapped buildings. So there's actually been an unprecedented level of interactions between different infantry divisions and an approach that was essentially geared, again, to minimizing civilian casualties and being as targeted as possible against the terrorists in this instance.
I'm curious to know your thoughts on the Gaza plan moving forward. Right now, supposedly Hamas were meant to disarm, but they seem to be rearming. We're hearing that other Arab and Islamic countries will be involved in the governing of it. I wonder, well, what's going to happen if Israel, as it inevitably will need to go in the future and police the area from terrorists that are plotting, doing all kinds of bad things? Will that mean that they're somehow going to war with these other countries? Do you have any concerns about the proposals moving forward?
Yeah, enormous concerns. And I have to say that what we've been seeing over the last few weeks is the opposite of encouraging. Lindsey Graham, I believe, was visiting Israel recently and said that there should be a time frame and a deadline for Hamas disarmament because, frankly, this is being allowed to drag out. As you have said, there are even reports of Hamas rearming. Certainly it is restocking, resupplying with the volume of aid that Israel has been facilitating into the Gaza Strip. And Hamas have repeatedly stated publicly that they have no intention of disarming. Now, this is an integral part of phase one of Trump's plan, as was the release of all hostages. And it's important that we remember that Ran Gvili is still in Hamas captivity. This is the deceased hostage that Hamas is still refusing to release. So that is a very important part of phase one that hasn't been complied with. But equally, the disarmament of Hamas is ultimately a non-negotiable for Israel because it was an integral part of the war aims. And if Hamas continue to operate as this terrorist organization, this military force, if they continue to threaten Israel with a recurrence of the 7th of October, then that crucial part of the war aim has not been achieved. And then we come on to the question of, in particular, Turkey and Qatar pushing for forces on the ground, especially from Turkey. Now, that is very worrying when you consider Turkey's attitude and approach to Israel, not just throughout this war, but over the last decade, certainly. That being the case and the hostility that Turkey is exhibiting to Israel, I mean, it rather suggests that we would be seeing the introduction of forces on the ground in Gaza that would be fighting Israel alongside Hamas, rather than what Trump envisaged, which this is, a broader international effort to minimize the possibility that Hamas reestablishes itself in Gaza for the good of Palestinian civilians as well as for the good of Israelis going forward. What we have seen, unfortunately, is, if you will, an entrenchment of Hamas in the areas in which Israel has withdrawn from as part of this agreement in Gaza. Again, they're rearming, they're terrorizing civilians. We've seen appalling videos of the torture and murder of civilians that have been meted out by Hamas as part of their re-establishment of this control of the area. And that is a very shameful consequence of this international framework, which, let's not forget, the 20-point plan was ultimately endorsed by the UN the UN Security Council in its resolution 2803. And there are some big questions, I think, that need to be answered in light of the international endorsement for what now appears to be Hamas's continuing breaches of that plan, and necessarily of the provisions, therefore, of that Security Council resolution too.
Yeah, completely agree. I think the current plan moving forward is utterly insane and just not learning the lessons of the past. Just lastly, I know you've got to go in a second, but my last question to you, which I was really curious to know your thoughts on, as someone that understands law and international law, but particularly I'm thinking domestic law for Western countries. A lot of us in the pro-Israel, pro-Western camp are saying now is the time for the Western governments to get a grip of jihadist plots and terrorism, but also, the hate marches that we're seeing. But then a lot of people push back and they say, yeah, but what about free speech? What about, civil liberties, all these things? Do you have any specific legal proposals that Western governments can enact right now that can help move us in a better direction?
So I don't actually think new legislation is necessary. It's not required. When one looks at for example, in the UK, when one looks at what's already in the statute books, there are provisions against support for terrorism. There within the Terrorism Act, it's an offence. There are, there's legislation to do with incitement, to do with promoting hate, certainly that covers the incitement to genocide that we have seen. So it is about applying these laws properly, enforcing them. Now we've seen I think a clear indication that my assessment here is accurate with respect to the Manchester Police and the Metropolitan Police saying after the Bondi Beach attacks that they will be policing and arresting those individuals that they see committing the offence of calling for globalising the Intifada. There was no change in legislation to enable them to do that. It was simply a change in attitude by these police forces that they now say they are willing to enforce the law. I would that had been the case 2 years ago. We may be in a very different situation as a result.
On JTV, the global Jewish channel with a host named Ollie.
Well, when even she's talking about you, you know you're having an impact. Thanks for the promo, Candice.
When I launched JTV, the mission was simple: to bring Jewish ideas to the world, intelligently, creatively, proudly. But I never realised just how critical that mission would become today. Because let's be honest, look at the world right now. Anti-Semitic voices aren't just coming from one place anymore. They're rising from the left and the right, online and offline, from influencers to institutions. That makes voices like ours more crucial than ever. When the noise gets louder, the Jewish voice needs to get stronger. And that's exactly why JTV exists. And look how far we've come. Because of your support, JTV has grown in extraordinary ways. Our videos now reach millions across continents with clear, honest, original content at a time when the world needs clarity more than ever. Whether it's telling the uncompromising truth about Israel or the incredible depth and wisdom of Jewish ideas, We've brought you exclusive interviews with leading thinkers, creators, and voices shaping the Jewish and Israel conversation today. And in addition to our new members streaming platform, we've produced powerful documentaries that are freely available on our YouTube channel for everyone to watch, exploring the challenges and triumphs of the Jewish story. And the best part? We're not just talking to an echo chamber. Our audience is made up of Jews and non-Jews in equal measure, of all ages and backgrounds. You've watched us grow, video by video, story by story, but this is just the beginning. Now JTV is ready for its next leap forward, to scale our content, expand our reach, and bring thoughtful and inspiring Jewish media to an even wider global audience. And this is where you come in. Your support fuels everything: the research, the cameras, the creativity, the deeper investigations, the editing, the more high-profile interviews, and the bold ideas that inspire pride, wisdom, and truth. Every viewer matters, every story counts, and every donation helps JTV grow, not just in numbers, but in global impact. So if you've ever appreciated one of our videos, if JTV has ever informed you, inspired you, or helped you help others, please help us grow by clicking the link in the video description and donating to our campaign fundraiser. With your help, you won't just watch us grow, you'll help us grow even higher. Thank you, and keep watching us grow.